In this video, I'll show you how to paper piece this log cabin block. I'll also go over some quick cutting steps at the end of the video. The finished size for this pattern is a 3-inch square, but you can use this same technique to make different size log cabin blocks. I want to point out something that's a little bit different from the first two blocks that we did in this paper piecing series. You'll notice that my completed block is a mirror image of the pattern. This automatically happens when I sew on the back. If paper piecing patterns are symmetrical like these two, you won't notice any difference. If they're asymmetrical, like this log cabin pattern, you'll notice when you start here on the pattern, number 2, 3, 4, 5. On the completed block, here's 1, and 2 is on this side, 3, 4 is over here, and 5 is up on the top. When you get a block like this turkey, the pattern, the turkey's facing this way. The completed block, the turkey's facing that way. This is one reason why paper piecing can be confusing. To paper piece this simple log cabin block, you'll need to download a pattern at learnhowtoquilt.com and then cut around the dashed lines. It doesn't have to be perfect. I usually leave a little extra so I have something to hold on to. These solid lines on the pattern are my sew lines, which make it easy for you to be accurate even with small pieces. All you have to do is sew on the line. The numbers on the pattern show the order to sew fabric pieces. Your fabric doesn't go on this side of the pattern. When paper piecing, it always goes on the back of your pattern. This usually causes confusion because you're sewing backwards. First, it might seem difficult, but after a few pieces, you'll find it much simpler. I like to take an old postcard or a card and fold the line between 1 and 2. There's the line between 1 and 2. Just fold it. Every time I fold this paper, the fibers in the paper are weakened. Later on, this will make it easier to pull off the paper. I also find that this helps with fabric positioning and trimming seams. For this block, I like to fold all the lines first, as I find it makes it easier when I'm sewing later on, but it's not a necessity. I'll be following this guide as I cut and sew. You can download this at learnhowtoquilt.com under Beginner Basics Paper Piecing. Here's my first piece of fabric that I've pressed with a hot dry iron. It has to be big enough to cover the number 1 square, with a little extra all the way around for a seam allowance. There's no set seam allowance, but I still need a little bit of extra fabric so I can sew in those seams. I'll cut this down into a more manageable piece. I could take this over to my rotary cutter and my mat, but I find it just as easy if I'm doing one just to cut with my scissors. Here's my number 1 piece of fabric. I see that that covers that shape. Put my finger there, turn it over, and I know that it's going to go somewhere here. I've folded this pattern ahead of time so I can see my lines there, or I could take it and hold it up to a light source and see those dark lines. Put this over the top of number 1, and then I'll pin it. I could see that that more than enough covers that number 1 spot. Let me show you an easy way to make sure that your fabric's covering the number 1 square. I'll use a flashlight so you can see the shadow from my fabric, and you'll see that it more than enough covers on this side, on the bottom, on this side, and then across the top. After I see that everything's covered, I like to trim the shape. This isn't necessary, but I find it helps me with fabric placement on the back of the pattern. I'll fold my pattern down on the line between 1 and 2. This is the section that I'd like to trim. It already looks like it's pretty close to a 1/4 inch seam. That rarely happens, but let me just trim it down. I'm going to eyeball a 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch. For fabric number 2, I've cut a piece of fabric that's big enough to cover that number 2 square, and I also have to make sure that it's going to cover this seam allowance out here up to the dotted line. I did say there's no set seam allowance, but if I want to sew this block to another block, then I need a 1/4 inch seam out here. I like to put my finger on number 2 while turning the pattern over so I know where to place my fabric. Number 2 fabric will go right here. This is what it's going to look like after it's been sewn, with 1 here and 2 over here. When we sew, usually we put right sides together. This is also true in paper piecing. I can't move fabric number 1 because it's pinned, but I can move fabric number 2 to put right sides together. I'll line it up along this edge that I just trimmed. Now I could flip this pattern over and begin sewing on this line here between 1 and 2, but what I like to do is check to make sure I've got everything covered. To do this, I like to put a pin on this sewing line here. It acts as sort of a temporary basting. So I'll turn the pattern over and I'll flip that fabric back to where it belongs. This is what it's going to look like when it's been sewn, and I need to check on this side to make sure that that fabric, it covers up here, and I can see that that fabric is going to more than enough cover this line here, that it covers this line over here, and I can see that, or I could hold it up to the light or use a flashlight, and also that that fabric covers this 1/4 inch seam out here. I'm ready to take it over to my sewing machine. To sew, I'm using red thread so you can see better. Usually I use a neutral color thread. A larger needle will also help perforate your patterns and make it easier to tear off the paper, but it's not necessary. You can also use a shorter stitch length to help with this. On my pattern, I need to start sewing 1 or 2 stitches before I hit this black line, and then continue sewing on this black line till I get to the next black line. I'll go 1 or 2 stitches past that. Need to take that pin out and just sew straight on that black line. When I get to this black line, 1 or 2 stitches and take it out. Clip your threads. These threads have a tendency to get caught up in here, so I always make sure that I clip all of my threads before I start on the next section. Let me flip this back. I need to take this over to the iron to press it, or if it's a little piece like this, I can probably get by with just finger pressing. Now I'm ready to add fabric number 3. I fold the line between 2 and 3, and actually this line is going to go between 1, 2, and 3. I fold this line back and I'll trim that excess. Now eyeball about between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch. Doesn't have to be perfect. Now I'm at number 3. I've cut this piece out ahead of time. You can see it more than enough covers the rectangle and the seam allowance. Put my finger on number 3, flip it over. I know that my number 3 fabric will end up right here after it's been sewn, but I have to sew it down. When I sew, I usually put right sides together. I can't move these 2 pieces of fabric, but I can move this one. So let me flip it over the top with right sides together. Come over here. I'm going to pin that sew line between 1, 2, and 3. Sort of base it, and let me see what's going to happen when I pull this back. When I pull that back, let's flip it over here, I can see that it more than enough covers this rectangle here, covers this 1/4 inch on the bottom and on the side. So I'm ready to take it over to my sewing machine. Take my pin out. Just like before, I'm going to start 1 or 2 stitches past this line. Some people like to draw that in, but I can follow my crease. So all the way to the edge. Now this is a little bit different. When I get to the end of this line, I want to keep sewing all the way through the seam allowance here past this dashed line. So I've sewn all the way down this line into the seam allowance and beyond. Let's turn it over And you can see I just barely caught that, but that's okay as long as I have fabric in that seam. You flip this over. This is kind of a bigger piece, so I think I'll take this over to iron before I go any further. I've pressed fabric number 3 and now I'm ready to start on number 4. I'll fold the paper. You'll notice that this little stitch right here looks like it's about ready to come out. When you sew the next seam, it'll get caught up in that and you don't have to worry about it unraveling. So let me trim this, fold the paper back. This is where fabric number 4 is going to go. I've cut a piece this size. It's more than enough to cover. Put my finger on fabric number 4, turn it over. This is where fabric number 4 will reside. I'll flip this over on top of the other pieces and pin. I've pinned between 1 and 4 and I'm ready to come over to the sewing machine. When these strips get longer, like this strip, sometimes they have a tendency to pull back and they make a mess behind here. So you might want to take your finger, or you could take another pin and pin right in there, but really make sure that that's stays flat. Want to sew 1 to 2 stitches before the line and all the way through to this dashed line, making sure to take out my pin as I sew. I've clipped my threads. Let me turn it over and fold that back. I'll take it over to the iron to be pressed. I'm ready to add fabric number 5. Now I've got 2 places where those stitches are going to get caught up. And just hold it like that and let me trim. Doesn't have to be perfect. Fold that back. Here's fabric number 5. I've cut it more than big enough to cover number 5 rectangle and all these seam allowances around it. Put it on the back. Going to go right here. Put right sides together. All the blocks we've done so far, this is the trickiest one. For some reason I think I've got it and I don't make it wide enough to cover that seam allowance line. So I'm going to put the pin there and check. So let's fold it back. Oh, and I can see I just barely make that seam. I could adjust it a little. Let me just pull this back just a little. I think it's going to work. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to use a pin to check it. I start sewing on the dashed line. I follow the black line and sew all the way through this dashed line. Trim. I'll flip this back, finger press it for now so you can see that I've more than enough covered those lines all the way around. This is a lighter color fabric than the other ones, and sometimes in paper piecing you have to be careful when you use a lighter color fabric. You'll notice on this seam, this darker green and pink are a little bit larger than this white seam, and you'll get a fabric shadow there. Whenever I'm using a lighter color fabric, I want to get in there and trim out that darker color. Let me get in behind here. I'm going to trim it a little less wide than that white. Do you see where I've trimmed that back a little bit? And sometimes that'll help you not see that fabric shadow if you're using a light color fabric. Now I'm ready to trim off the excess. I want to trim around these dashed lines. I can use my scissors to do that, but I usually like to use my rotary cutter. If I'm using my scissors, sometimes I'll stitch a line between the solid line and the dashed line like this. I'll stitch that line all the way around. Make sure that this fabric doesn't flap up when I'm cutting. Do you see? The fabric wants to come out. I don't think it's necessary if you're rotary cutting though. Here's my completed block. I often make many log cabins so I can put them together in the quilt. To save time, I rotary cut strips wide enough to cover this pattern. For this pattern, I like to cut strips about 1.5 inches to 1.75 inches. I then cut sections off each one of the strips corresponding to the numbers on the pattern. Then I line these sections up in the order to be sewn. For more information about paper piecing, please visit learnhowtoquilt.com, Beginner Basics, Paper Piecing.